And now, without further ado, I think this is what he came here for. So I'm very delighted, very excited to present Professor Michael Walzer with the second public annual lecture called To Sojourn in the Land or Become an Argument About Immigration. Professor.
So thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, and I am also glad that I don't have to talk about the bombing policies of the Israeli Air Force, or for that matter, the American Air Force. So I will be arguing about immigration today, and in my argument I will be using mostly American examples. I am engaged in the American debate on immigration. I don't think that debate, however, is all that different from the same debate going on in many other countries. I don't think that any Jew can write on this subject without reflecting on our history. That history includes these lines from Bereshit and from the Haggadah, which we read at this year's Seder and discussed. To sojourn in the land are we come, for thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. I will come back briefly to this moment when I talk about chain migration, but now I just want to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and that we are commanded to remember that time and draw conclusions from the memory. So I hope that everything I've written about immigration is written under that commandment. When you don't have a state, there isn't much to talk about with regard to immigration. It's not a major topic in halakha. It's not a legal issue for a stateless people. There are some responsa about when one becomes a member of the kahal with the obligations that entails. There's the injunction to favor the local poor over the poor of other places. There are rules about hospitality for wandering Jews. And as far as I know, not much more. So today, no longer stateless, Israeli Jews have a double obligation, not only to think like strangers in Egypt, but also like citizens here. For me, the debate about immigration is also a debate about justice, about distributive justice. Membership in the community is the first good that we distribute, not among ourselves, but to outsiders. And by distributing membership, we shape the community within which the other distributions take place: education, healthcare, social security, and so on. Years ago, I tried to work out principles that would guide the necessary decisions, first about residence in the country, and then about citizenship in the state. The principles were meant to reflect the meaning of membership in different places and to provide an account of both openness and closure at the border. Though I know that consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, I haven't changed my mind about what I wrote in the 1980s. But I need to say it all again, and to say it perhaps differently. In today's world, where there are so many people clamoring for admission to countries like the United States and the member states of the European Union and Israel too, and where nationalist demagogues are promoting hostility to these outsiders in trouble and also to their advocates inside. I did not defend open borders when I first wrote about immigration, and I won't defend them now. Still, I am one of those inside advocates. In the United States today, We don't need walls to keep outsiders out, for the simple reason that we should be taking large numbers of them in. So I want to begin with an American story that goes a long way toward defining the kind of country America is and explaining why it's different from other countries, or a lot of other countries. An Anglo-American settler population, having displaced the Native Americans, set about creating an Anglo-American nation state. Their America would have been politically different from the old countries of Europe with their monarchs and aristocrats, but it would not have been ethnically different. It would have been a constitutional republic of English speakers, mostly from England and Scotland, and almost entirely Protestant. A white Anglo-Saxon Protestant republic, a WASP republic, with an African population enslaved and barred from citizenship. And then, in the course of the 19th century, these settlers, with considerable reluctance and sporadic resistance, allowed themselves to become a minority in what they thought was their country. How did this happen? First of all, the settlement was relatively recent. With the big exception of the displaced Indians, America was no one's ancient homeland. It was already an immigrant society. And second, the settlers needed more settlers, more workers for a steadily expanding economy. And most historians will tell you that this need for workers was the major reason for America's open borders in the 19th century, and that's almost certainly true. But the need for workers explains only the open borders. It doesn't explain, it didn't necessarily lead to a republic open to new citizens. The strongest defenders of a WASP nation state, the strongest nationalists, didn't object so much to immigration. They were focused on naturalization. One of the key proposals of the Know-Nothing Party, that was the Nationalist Party, of the 1840s and 50s, was for a 25-year span between coming into the country and becoming a citizen. In 25 years, maybe, all those Irish Catholic immigrants or their children would become good Americans. In fact, the Irish began to vote long before that, and German 48ers were almost immediately politically engaged, and after the Civil War, Black Americans were entitled, and in a few places actually allowed to vote. And then, though Asian immigrants were barred, hundreds, hordes of Italians, Jews, my grandparents among them, Poles, Slovaks, and many others arrived, and the WASPs were suddenly a minority, not only among the inhabitants of the country, but also among the citizens of the Republic. Birthright citizenship made this process faster than it might otherwise have been, but the outcome, I think, was inevitable. Today, white nationalists, like the WASP nationalists of the 19th century, worry that they are on their way to minority status, and they are probably right. These transformations are what make America different. No one expects anything similar to happen in the old countries of Europe or in Asian countries like Japan. The Danes, for example, won't allow themselves to become a minority in their own country. If there was ever a likely prospect, or even a distant but possible prospect, no one would blame them for taking measures to prevent it from happening. Well, no one is probably an exaggeration. Advocates of open borders would castigate them as backward nativists. But let's imagine a not entirely weird scenario. Tens of millions of climate refugees are struggling to reach Europe. All the countries of the continent build physical or legal walls to keep them out, except Denmark, which holds a referendum on a proposal to take in millions, but to stop well short of making the Danes a minority in Denmark. There are two other options on the ballot. Voters can also choose to build the walls that everyone else is building, or to open the borders. Imagine yourself a Dane, not a philosopher, but an actual Dane. How would you vote? Well, you will soon be faced with the prospect of Jews becoming a minority in Greater Israel. How will you vote? But that's not going to happen because of immigration, and so it's not what I have to talk about this evening. Recently, a Polish nationalist politician argued against letting in a couple of thousand Syrians because, he said, he didn't want the Poles to become a minority in Poland. So that's the nasty version. Also, the dishonest version, there are 38 million Poles in Poland. That's the nasty and dishonest version of the argument I just made, but haven't yet defended. So this is the argument. People have a right to be at home in their homeland, and this is a right that liberals and leftists and all the members of the new global elites should acknowledge. It's not an absolute right. There are other rights of other people that may come into conflict with this one and require a politics of balance and compromise. But this one is real. A people's right to feel at home in the place where they live, where they have created a language, shared a history, shaped a landscape, established a calendar with holidays and ceremonies, participated, let's say, in a democratic politics, contributed to a mutually beneficial welfare state. They have a right to hope that their grandchildren will grow up in that place, nourished by its traditions, protected by its institutions, engaged with their fellow citizens. The idea that they are members of an ongoing community is something that most people feel and feel deeply, a community formed by the kind of contract that the English philosopher Edmund Burke described long ago among the living, the dead, and those who are yet to be born. Burke was a conservative writer, and I don't often agree with him. But the conservation of communal life is a value that liberals and leftists, again, need to understand and, with necessary qualifications, embrace. It's entirely compatible with a community that is open to outside political and cultural influence and to foreign immigrants. Indeed, all human communities, all political communities, evolve over time by taking in and naturalizing new ideas and new people. This has been going on for a very long time, and it shouldn't interfere with the experience of community and belonging. Now, the argument I've just made suggests only a distant limit on immigration. Open borders over time would certainly abolish homelands and communities, and cosmopolitan philosophers might welcome that. All boundaries, on their view, should be easy to cross. In a truly cosmopolitan world, no one would want to be permanently at home. Think of life in a long series of hotel rooms. But that world is far away. Even if we were to open the borders, the effects of openness would only be felt over time, and I mean time measured not in years but in decades. Good homelands have considerable staying power because of their integrative capacity, their ability to draw immigrants in through education, acculturation, political participation, and when racism isn't a factor, intermarriage. This should be a matter of pride. We can make large numbers of foreigners into home folks. The French, for example, did exactly that over much of the 20th century. In the United States, this integrative process was called Americanization, and there were fierce debates about what it entailed and whether it required coercion. Well, it did require coercion in the form of compulsory education, with both public and private schools required to teach courses in American history and politics. Still, the immigrants became Americans without becoming Protestants, and most of them without imitating Anglo-American customs, and often in the first generation without learning English. And today they are becoming Americans without becoming white. Surely something similar is possible in Denmark, say, or in Poland, but it's also possible to imagine Danes and Poles being overwhelmed in ways that Americans can't be. Hence my argument for a limit, for a right of closure somewhere down the line. I doubt that anyone actually argues for no closure, anytime, anywhere. Consider for a moment not our homelands, but our homes. The prophet Isaiah's description of what God requires extends that far. Quote, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke, to share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. To take the wretched poor into your home. Not many of us fulfill that last obligation, despite the fact that any person on the street or in a shelter would almost certainly be better off in one of our homes. So there seems to be a recognized right to domestic closure, a right that kicks in well before our pain would be greater than the benefit of the wretchedly poor man or woman whom we took in. National closure is a different story, but it isn't entirely different. Indeed, the argument is sometimes made that we shouldn't limit immigration until the pain to insiders is greater than the benefit to outsiders. So the argument I just rejected for homes is applied to homelands. But even this argument suggests a limit. So Joseph Cairns, the Canadian-American philosopher who has written what has to be the best defense of open borders, Joseph Cairns admits that in today's world of states, quote, there might be circumstances in which admitting more refugees would bring such high costs to the basic interests of those in the receiving society that exclusion would be justifiable. The limit that Cairns suggests would be very far down the road, too far perhaps, depending on how high costs are defined. Material and cultural definitions would produce different schedules for openness and closure. In any case, the question now is when, not whether, closure can be invoked. And I want to say not soon, but sooner than the cost-benefit analysis suggests, and conceivably sooner in some places than in others, depending on the integrative power of the homeland and the size and character of its population. At the same time, I want to insist again that the recognition of a moral right to closure at some point is entirely compatible with the recognition of many claims for admission. And now I want to list the claims. I'm not going to be concerned here with immigrants who come in under some legally established quota system or who are recruited because of their skills. Only with men and women who can plausibly argue that they should be taken in. And I assume that once they're taken in, they will be put on the path to citizenship. It seems obviously it seems obviously wrong to take people in, especially into a democratic state, and then deny them all political rights. I can imagine an argument from capitalist managers, say, or right-wing politicians that would go like this. We can bring in very large numbers of needed workers as long as we make them permanent guest workers, subordinated and always exploitable. But I don't take that to be a defensible position. So the claim of the outsiders is for full admission. So what are the obligations of those of us inside? The first outside claim is that of kinship. I mean both ethnic and ideological kinship. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Finns brought in thousands of Russo-Finns who might have been in trouble in a Russian nation state and put them on a fast road to citizenship. This was, I suppose, a discriminatory act. There were probably a lot of other people who were going to be in trouble in the new Russia. But I think that the Finns were right to recognize a special obligation to their ethnic fellows. That might not be the end of their obligations, but it was a good place to begin. There are many other examples of this kind of discrimination. The state of Israel taking in diaspora Jews in trouble, as Jews too often are, which is probably the most famous example of what really is a fairly common policy. Greece taking in Anatolian Turks after the establishment of the modern Turkish state. Or West Germany taking in the East Prussian and Sudetenland Germans after World War II. But there are also obligations that cross ethnic lines. After the defeat of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, thousands of refugees were allowed to enter Great Britain and stay on. London was suddenly full of Hungarians. I was studying in Britain that year, and the phenomenon was very noticeable. In the context of the Cold War, these were friends of the Western democracies, and Britain was one of the leading democracies, hence the obligation. But suppose the revolution had triumphed, the satellite regime had been overthrown, and the refugees were former communist officials and members of the secret police. I doubt that Britain would have felt any obligation to take them in. The Soviet Union would have been obligated, assuming that the refugees wanted to go there. In Russia, they were ideological kinfolk, not so in Britain. Ethnic and ideological kinship gives rise to state obligations. The second group of people claiming admission is constituted by familial relations, which give rise to personal obligations that are taken on by the state when it opens its doors to the parents or spouses or children of its citizens. This is what is called by its critics chain migration. Trump uses that word all the time, and given the mathematical work on degrees of separation, we can assume that the chains have no end. Each family claimant has relatives of his or her own, who have relatives of their own, who have relatives, and so on. So the state can set limits on the relationships that it recognizes in its immigration laws. Still, when we remember Joseph bringing in 70 of his relatives, we, American Jews, should set ourselves against the narrow limits that President Trump wants to impose. In any case, the obligation is real. Citizens have a claim on their state that it permit the reunion of separated family members. And this is another example of legitimate discrimination. There may be people in greater need than this sister of an American citizen and her husband and children and in-laws, But these people come first. The state, so to speak, recognizes and endorses the importance of the family. Men and women seeking political asylum make up the third group of people who claim a right to come in. The claim is based on the politics of their home country, where they can no longer feel at home. If they remain there, they say, they will be imprisoned, tortured, killed because of their political beliefs, their political activity, or their religion. The regime is brutal, and they are dissidents, heretics, or infidels, or their country is in the midst of civil war, and they are on the wrong side or the losing side. International law has established the right of such people to seek asylum, and the right of states to grant asylum, and very important, the right to refuse requests for extradition. But states have no legal obligation to grant asylum in any particular case. They have a right to investigate the claim, and perhaps, given the proliferation of brutal regimes in the world today, to set limits on the number of asylum seekers that they admit, or to look for help from other states. I would be inclined to argue that no state or no group of states can rightly, morally, turn asylum seekers away, as so many Jews were turned away in the Nazi years. More generally, liberal and democratic states should want to take in people threatened with repression because they are dissidents. Democracies need dissidents. There are some asylum seekers that we Americans undoubtedly have to take in. The ones who are fleeing brutal regimes that our government has promoted or funded. It would be better, of course, if the American government only promoted and funded non-repressive, liberal, democratic regimes. Different American policies in, say, Central America might significantly reduce the number of asylum seekers now struggling northwards. For now, we must recognize the moral consequences of what we are actually doing or of what we have done in the past in the countries of Central America. One more group of people require an American asylum: the men and women and their families who in one way or another collaborated with us in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, or who under American cover came out as Democrats, trade unionists, or feminists. These are people who will be at risk when we Americans leave. In the case of Vietnam, they were at risk and were not taken along with American soldiers and diplomats in the hasty, unplanned retreat from Saigon. Many of them were killed or sent to re-education camps after that, but some, the boat people, escaped on their own, often in great danger, and some of them were eventually brought to the United States, and some of them also to Israel. This is a case where generosity is obligatory, and we, Americans, have not been generous. The number of Iraqis and Afghans granted asylum is astonishingly low, even though the killing of men and women identified as friends of the Americans has already begun. You will remember the men and women taken in by Israel after the withdrawal from South Lebanon, a clear obligation. The last group of claimants are refugees. I follow the conventional distinction between people fleeing repression who seek asylum and people fleeing poverty or natural disaster who seek refuge. These last are the refugees. In fact, there's overlap between the two groups because brutal governments often rule over impoverished countries, and civil wars bring destitution in their wake. In any case, the group of refugees is very large, and there is no country in the world that can be expected to take in all of them. This is a burden that has to be shared, And at the moment, there is no agency capable of forcing reluctant countries to take in their share. The European Union tried to set quotas for its members, but many of them simply refused to accept the obligation, though the quotas were low, given the tide of refugees. Much larger quotas would still not come anywhere near the limit that I described earlier. They would not endanger the cultural coherence of EU states or reduce their material well-being or challenge the majority status of the natives. So I should stop here and recognize the remarkable distinction by the German government, led by Angela Merkel, to take in 1 million refugees in a single year, which should have set an example but didn't for the rest of the EU. The political reaction, the rise of right-wing nationalism, may already have made this a negative example. This is what you don't do if you want to survive in office. And yet again, neither the cultural coherence nor the material well-being of Germany has been put at risk by the new immigrants. All the evidence suggests that if the immigrants are welcomed and if naturalization is possible, they will become law-abiding and hard-working citizens. So the argument so far, my argument so far, would require a substantially more open immigration policy than exists in any country in the world today. But let's assume now that there is a limit of the sort I described or of some other sort. That wouldn't be the end of the story. It's a further requirement of distributive justice that if a country refuses, rightfully or not, to admit people in desperate need, its government has an obligation to export resources to help those same people or their friends and relatives not yet on the road. Bring people in or send resources out, or in the case of wealthy countries like the United States, do both at the same time. There is obviously a moral case for sending resources to impoverished countries, and there are also prudent reasons for doing that. The more resources that are sent, the fewer refugees on the road. But if resources need to be sent, it is at least equally important that they be received by competent authorities and used effectively. I have heard talk recently about the need for a Marshall Plan for Central America or the Middle East. And that's indeed a useful model, but it is also a warning. The original Marshall Plan in 1945, 6, 7, 8, actually, worked as well as it did because of the existence in Western Europe of strong governments able to spend the money in ways that rebuilt the local economies. There aren't many governments of that kind in Central America or the Middle East, some, but not many. In fact, the flow of refugees is driven not only by the brutality, but also by the incompetence of local governments or the virtual non-existence of any effective central authority. So what ought to be done? I can't argue for political or military intervention to create good governments. The United States has already intervened too often with precisely opposite results. Still, it is worth saying that if there were an international organization capable of forcing reform on brutal and corrupt regimes, that would be a good thing to do, so as to create governments capable, with help from abroad, of providing physical security, economic opportunity, and social welfare to their citizens. In the absence of governments like that, the best way to help is probably through civil society. There are many effective NGOs that do good work in impoverished countries, even countries in the middle of civil wars. Their staffs and their field workers are the best representatives of internationalism in the world today, and they deserve strong financial support. They contribute, though not yet in adequate ways, to make countries more livable. I haven't yet addressed the hardest question. In the decades to come, if the scientists are right, and they are probably right, we are going to see tens, maybe hundreds of millions of climate refugees fleeing what have become uninhabitable parts of our globe. Nobody is planning for these overwhelming numbers of desperate people. Without a plan, it's easy to predict what is going to happen in my country and probably in other countries. Suddenly, all of President Trump's lies about the crisis at our southern border will seem true. Xenophobia will have a more plausible object than ever before, and some future president will build the wall. No one at that moment, except perhaps our most saintly fellow citizens, will argue for open borders. I find it hard to believe that any kind of liberal or left internationalism will survive that moment of global crisis. I don't mean that there won't be acts of generosity or philanthropic organization or efforts to reduce the suffering of some of the refugees, but millions and millions of people will simply have no place to go. We have already seen the rise of far-right political parties and nationalist demagogues in response to what is really a small-scale flow of refugees toward Europe and the United States. That response is, as I've already said, nasty and dishonest, and we can hope for its near-term defeat. The Danes, the French, the Germans, the Poles, they are all far short of becoming minorities in their own countries. They have so much integrative power and so much room for growth that a pro-immigrant policy is certainly defensible and certainly desirable. In Israel, too, it seems to me, and in the United States, far more so. But the hypothetical Danish scenario that I described at the beginning of my talk is now a predictable happening. Stable populations will rightly see themselves as radically at risk, and the result will be the closing of borders. And that result will be both morally justifiable and morally disastrous. That may seem an implausible combination. It can fit only very bad times. So, we need to address climate change right now. That is, no doubt, an insufficiently urgent sentence, given the future I've just described. But unless there is a divine revelation repeating Isaiah's message about taking the wretched poor into our homes, a revelation that captures everyone's mind and heart, we had better act now in mundane and practical ways on a very large scale. We won't do well when the flood comes, but there is still time to do well before that. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very, very much for this, really well-argued thought about immigration. I learned a lot, but I imagine there might be questions.
Arguments also?
Arguments, ideas, suggestions. Could you just please stand up that we can all hear you better? Also the audience.
Yeah, well, I'd like to ask the honorable professor that, let's put it this way, in Israel too, many of the people are not very satisfied with the current situation going on with illegal people that already came here, and they want them to go somewhere else. They even found them a third country, which has a very progressive immigration policy, a third world country, but still they can sustain themselves there. And I'd be happy to know, where is the fine line between the democratic will of the people and, you know, let's say the more progressive view about asking that these people will be kind of integrated in a society?
Look, in a democracy, this is a question we need to argue about. There isn't a democratic will until there is an open debate. We've only begun in the Western world. We've only begun a debate about immigration and what we owe to people outside and to people inside. So the question isn't choosing between the democratic will and my progressive ideas or yours about immigration. The question is how do we participate in forming a democratic will that wills a decent solution to the questions of immigration? And then the question is, what side are you on in that debate? Because you're not choosing between a democratic will and a progressive immigration policy. You're choosing what should be the democratic will. You're participating in the formation of the democratic will. And I am trying to argue in my own country that we should be forming a democratic will to take in more and more immigrants. Now, it's easier in the United States than in Western Europe or Israel, because the United States has been from the beginning an immigrant society. But this is a debate that goes on everywhere. And the question is, what position do you want to take? Now, in Israel, you have two questions. You have questions about who you want to take in from outside. You also have a question about how you treat the people you've already taken in. And in some ways, the second of those is the more immediate and urgent question. In Haaretz this morning, there is an article about 100 Filipino mothers who are about to be deported with their children born in Israel. Born in Israel. These are children whose first language is Hebrew, who grew up here, who are Israelis. And I think it would be an indecent act and a dishonor to the state of Israel to export these people. I've argued for many, many years in the United States and whenever I travel in Europe that if you need workers and if you take in guest workers, you can't treat them like some exploitable group of people without rights. You've got to take them in. If you take them in, if you need them in your economy, you have to admit them also to your polity. You have to make them, put them on the road to citizenship.
Why do you have to do that?
Excuse me.
Why? Well, I should answer that question. Why do you have to do that? Well, if I can imagine other arrangements, if there were other arrangements, if you had treaties with the countries from which they come, guaranteeing the rights of, say, guaranteeing the rights of Finns in Norway, or guaranteeing the rights of Macedonians in Norway, and the treaties were enforceable, so that guest workers in Norway had all the rights that were specified in the treaty, and these rights were enforced. That might be an alternative arrangement, but in the absence of arrangements like that, you cannot take in people and treat them as men and women without rights. I'm not going to be able to hear without a microphone. Or if,
I can come closer. I'm saying that with all respect to the United States, which is an immigrant country, Israel has its own unique elements, which is she's not just a democratic country, she's also a Jewish country, which means that bringing in people to our country would actually endanger the integrity of the society living inside it, because most people seeking shelter in Israel are not Jewish. Now, I'm not a very religious person, and I do argue treating the people already inside the country with respect, because they do live here and they are human beings and they deserve to be treated as such. But you can't say that Israel can have the same policy as the United States about open borders, because the United States is made out of immigrants. Bringing in more immigrants would not endanger the integrity of it. And on the other hand, Israel, by bringing in people that are not from the same culture, from the same religion, is endangering the integrity of the country. I'm not exactly sure how you can say that it's the same.
I didn't say it was the same. The whole point of my introduction was to say that America is different, and that that I accept the right of countries that are ancient nation states, or even new nation states. I accept the right of countries like that to defend the status of the majority and the cohesion of the culture. But I want to argue that you have, all countries have, all, especially good countries, have the capacity to take in and integrate people and turn them into home folks. The question always is, what is your integrative capacity, and how many people can you take in? Well, Israel has a substantial Jewish majority, and you can certainly take in a few thousand Sudanese refugees who are desperate people, as you took in some of the Vietnamese boat people, and I don't think it threatened the Jewishness of the state. You have to argue among yourselves about how many you can take in, but the numbers are not small that you can absorb. And you don't want to be like the Polish nationalists. I hope you don't want to be like the Polish nationalists who, speaking for 38 million Poles, says that a few thousand refugees from Syria are a danger to the Polishness of the state. They aren't a danger. In fact, their grandchildren will probably be good Poles.
Okay, please stand up. No. There are a lot of questions. I'm trying to be fair.
Speaking in the context of Israel, I think we have an elephant in the room, because there is other refugees who are in the midst of political discussion, people who were living here and ran away due to war or expelled. What is your position on such situations? Do the locals, the ones who won the war, have any obligation towards others that had to leave?
Yeah, I don't think Israel is in any obligation to take in Palestinians in numbers that would endanger the Jewish majority. We can argue about the history. The way I would frame the argument is with an analogy, or a couple of analogies. Suppose all the Hindus who were either fled or pushed out of Pakistan in 1948 had not been taken in India, but had been kept in camps ever since 48. Their children taught that their homeland was north. The situation, if that had happened, the situation between India and Pakistan, bad as it has been, would be infinitely worse. If West Germany had taken the refugees from the Sudetenland and from East Prussia and put them in camps and told them that they had a right to return to the Sudetenland and East Prussia, and kept them in camps from 45 to 2019, there would be no peace in Central Europe. So I do not. I very strongly believe that the failure, which was a political failure, to resettle the Palestinians in Arab countries around Israel, and the refusal to do that had a purpose, and the purpose was to sustain the conflict. And I don't think you have to feel that you need to suffer for that political failure. And I don't think that has really any relevance to the question of a struggling Eritrean family walking across the Sinai and knocking at your border, Negev border.
There is the
Wait.
Okay, so you said before that the answer to a question that came from that side of the room, that the limit of the limit of the country's ability to take people in should be more or less based on their capacity to culturally acclimatize those people to whatever culture that particular country has. So say in a hypothetical situation, say that we had that particular limit sitting right now on the borders of Israel, waiting to come in. I'm not suggesting that it's the reality, but say that this was a situation that happened to be. Israel's culture is, if not entirely, at least somewhat an ethnic culture.
Somewhat?
Ethnic. In that we have this concept of a Jewish state, and Judaism can it can be connected to religiosity, but no matter how much you teach a refugee about Judaism or how much they, say, speak Hebrew or whatever the case may be, our capacity to culturally acclimatize people is always going to be limited to some kind of either blood relationship or, say, a mother who's Jewish, or conversion. Would you suggest in such a circumstance, as people in our capacities, number of people waiting on our borders, that something like conversion should be used within that cultural acclimatization process?
I didn't hear the end of it.
If conversion should be used to take people into enculturate them.
No, I don't. I don't think that. Yeah, we in the U.S. the Jewish community is dealing with the phenomenon of something like 50% intermarriage, and it's a question of immigration. Can we take all these people in? And the Orthodox community is saying no, we can't, and refuses to recognize intermarriage and to make any effort to take in the non-Jewish spouse. And conservative congregations are wavering in different ways, and Reform congregations are welcoming them if they commit to raise Jewish children. I think that's the right decision. In any case, if we don't want to slowly disappear, it's a decision that I think we have to make. Now, Israel, you have a lot of difficulties because you are a Jewish state, but you are also a state of Israel. The only recognized way of becoming Jewish is conversion. The only recognized way of joining the Jewish people is conversion. You remember what Ruth says in the biblical story, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." Now, maybe we should separate those two statements. We should allow people to become members of the Jewish people, and in another process, members of the religious community. But that wouldn't solve the problem. People would then become Jews, but what about what does it mean to become an Israeli? And you have a lot of problems here of identity. Some of the very early Zionists, some of the most radical Zionists, really believed that there is a Jewish people, which is like the French people or the Norwegian people. And in principle, they believed that members of the Jewish people could have any religion. They could be Methodists or Presbyterians or Muslims or Buddhists. I guess there are some Buddhists, but that's what they believe. Now that hasn't worked out. And I can't come from New Jersey and tell you how to work it out, but that is a question you're going to have to work out, whether Israel is the state of the Jewish people or whether it is a state of the Jewish religion.
But you see, even Judaism takes great pride in having invented the universal God. I mean, even the second part of Ruth's story is nothing that there's no Jewish God. I mean, not according to most streams of Judaism. So
right.
It doesn't even work in this way. But
you began by giving a biblical source for the need to be open to immigration by the story of Joseph. But I think that example might undermine your whole claim. Because if we read further on what was the outcome of that immigration, well, it ended up in disaster. Because the Egyptian population eventually, at a certain point, basically began to eradicate those Jewish immigrants. And the reason, apparently, for the failure was, for one, that immigration group didn't want to integrate into Egyptian society, probably. And two, its reproductive rates were so high that suddenly a small group of 70 people, you said, became a massive people. And as far as the ramifications, as far as our questions in modern times, I think you understate the challenges for nation states by saying bringing a small number of people. We're fully aware of what's happening in Europe and certain Europe nation states where these immigrant groups have dramatically different reproductive family and growth rates. And on the second point, a lot of these groups have no interest whatsoever in integration into the absorbing culture. Some of them are antagonistic to the absorbing culture, but they are populations with strong ethnic identities, strong religious identities. And what was lacking, and I think in your presentation, is really grappling with this issue of nation states facing immigration which has no interest in integrating in the general society and really poses threats to the identity of these nation states. And I think understating the idea by saying allowing certain numbers coming in when we ignore the difference in reproduction, growth, and family structures of these immigrating groups. These really pose dangers to, I think, the national identities at stake here.
Okay, that's the counter argument to what I said. First of all, Egypt was not a democracy. The immigrants were entirely dependent on a court Jew, and when the court Jew disappeared, there was no prospect of becoming political and economically integrated while remaining culturally, religiously independent, which is possible in modern democratic states. So, what about, you're talking about Muslim immigrants, and that's the central issue in European politics today. And if you read the arguments, from American history, I can tell you that the Irish immigrants were talked about in exactly the same way. They drink, they reproduce in vast numbers, and they're loyal to the Pope, and they will never be American citizens. And in 2 or 3 years, they were practically running New York City, and they were very good at democratic politics. And the same things were said about Orthodox Jews, cannot integrate. They will never want to integrate. They can never be Americans. It's such an old argument. And there is so much evidence to suggest that if there are opportunities for political and economic equality and for cultural autonomy, cultural freedom, if those opportunities really exist, most immigrants from any culture are going to adapt and integrate.
You think that's what's happening in France nowadays?
The situation of many of the Muslim immigrants is desperate in France. They are poor, they are harassed by the police. I have my colleague at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton is a French sociologist who does studies of police behavior in Paris. He travels with the police, and what they do is beat up Muslim immigrants. And that's not the way you integrate a community.
So we hear on the other side very old arguments which were used against Jews often and are now being used against Muslims. And isolated incidents of extreme behavior or terrorism are used to attack entire communities. In Israel, we have another elephant in the room besides the one you mentioned, the Palestinian citizens in the country. So people already feel, Jews already feel social cohesion is threatened, even without relating to any immigrants. But that's not my question. My question is, how do we have a reasoned debate when the arguments against 30 or 40 or 50,000 Africans tend to populist extremism? When the arguments become completely detached from the real facts, and combine that with the incompetence in absorbing the people who did come into the country before we put up a fence in the Sinai to stop them from coming in, with no plan whatsoever to deal with them in any way. And then we blame them and blow it up to be some huge threat. So how do you have a discussion when one side is coming with populist messages filled with hate-mongering and fear-mongering, and the other side is trying to talk reasonably?
You don't deal with that with hatred already.
There is a prudential political argument for setting limits on immigration, which is simply that we are afraid of provoking far-right nationalist political movements that will destroy our democracies. And And that is an argument. And there may be good reasons for, and I heard this argument in Germany recently. I stopped in Germany on my way here. There are Germans who think that that Merkel took in too many too fast, not because it threatens the cultural cohesion of Germany, but because it has enabled right-wing demagogues. Interestingly, they are strongest in East Germany, where the communist regime once ruled. So that could be an argument for saying slow down. But that's a political and a prudential, it's not a moral argument.
Maybe it's because the immigrants are aggressive? Those poor immigrants, as you call them, are not, maybe they are poor, but they are also aggressive. Immigrants are aggressive persons.
Really? How is that empirically wrong? It was debunked that they have lower crime rate than the general population. It was rubbish. And now an updated report came out, police reports. They have, I think, 25 times more likelihood to rob theft than the general population.
Yes.
I would suggest we go back to...
But it's definitely not less in the general population. No, really, it's ridiculous. I mean, to think that 30,000 people between the ages of 20 and 40, you know, how do you say, it came out of the Horn of Africa. They were dumped in the center of I'm from South Tel Aviv, I live there. And to think that they have a lower crime rate than the general population, it's beyond naive, like really.
Is there any question to this, or would you like make the statement? Very nice, and now please the question.
Firstly, I'd just like to make a comment. You raised an article in Haaretz about Filipinos and whether there's intergovernmental agreements. There is very certainly an intergovernmental agreement with the government of Philippines. It is statutory. I've seen it, and it exists. So there's no such thing as we just dumping people. It's not happening. It's all very legal, and if you check it up rather than from the newspaper, you'll probably find the truth there. That's the first issue. The second issue is that you haven't seemed to address the question of economic migrants. And certainly, the people that came from Africa initially might have been proper refugees, political refugees, fleeing oppression, etc. But what it grew into was a pipeline for people traveling from poorer to richer countries. And that is my perception of what I've been seeing it happening in the States as well, is that there are actually organizations that are facilitating migration, and it's economic migration. It's not refugees. And one has to actually be able to distinguish between these things if one wants to have a policy. But you can't just say we're going to accept somebody because they want to come in, because they're poor and we have a rich country, so the population policy here.
Yeah, well, I thought I did distinguish people seeking political asylum and people who are seeking refuge from poverty or natural disaster. And I agree that the number of people who are trying to come into, leaving poor countries and trying to come into rich countries pose a major problem, less so for many rich countries that need workers. The Germans need more than the million people they took in. They need a larger workforce. So there are economic arguments for taking people in, as well as for keeping people out. But we need a wider discussion of distributive justice if we're going to address the question of refugees from impoverished countries. We need some version of global redistribution so that these poor countries can hold their own citizens. And it's not likely to happen, I know, but the EU in its early years did do some redistributive measures to improve the economy of Portugal and Italy, from which people were coming to France and Germany, and that did help. So we know that most human beings do not want to leave home. And if conditions are decent at home, they won't leave. And maybe some of the adventurous ones will leave, but most people won't leave. And if we can improve conditions in countries like Honduras or El Salvador, there will be very, very smaller numbers of people marching toward America's southern border.
Can we take one last question?
A small remark and question. Think about 1948 Israel, very poor country, that Ben-Gurion and all the elites decides to take their money and go to Switzerland. That will be a huge brain drain on Israel, and Israel will then stay poor because they lose their elite. What we are doing here, letting the Sudanese and Ethiopians coming to Israel, it's not the poor that are coming, it is their elite. They take the money to arrive here, and what those countries are losing is their brain drain.
This is not fact.
We are today in a time that social capital and human capital is the way you develop a country, and not by poor work. And therefore, the fact that we are letting here Filipinos with the money that they have here, not going back and creating their elite there with the human capital that they got in Israel by working here, is in fact against justice. Justice for the poor in the Filipinos, justice for the poor in Sudan. You need the elite to go back there. As Ben-Gurion was staying in this very poor country and not leaving to Switzerland.
Well, think of, say, Poland and Russia in 1900. How much better it would have been if the Jews had been forced to go back and stay in Russia. How much better it would have been for Russia, but not better for the Jews.
Yes? So what is justice? What is justice?
Okay, I thank you very, very much for this lively discussion.